And welcome back. For over 50 years, Legal Momentum has been at the forefront of national civil rights efforts, tirelessly dedicated to advancing gender equality. The Women Valued Initiative aims to amplify the needs and voices of some of the most underserved in the economy, including women of color, immigrant women, workers in low-wage industries, and survivors of gender-based violence. Joining me now, we are pleased to have the Director of Economic Justice at Legal Momentum, Seher Khawaja, and we thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Darren. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And when we talk about the issue of gender inequality, I mean, obviously, this is a conversation that we've been having for years, and we're still having it again to this day. From your perspective, obviously, there have been some things have gotten better, but how do you see things playing out right now?
Well, Darren, you mentioned that we've been doing this work for over 50 years now. I think that speaks to, on the one hand, kind of our deep, rich knowledge on these issues, but it also speaks to the intractability of these issues. We have been fighting for a very long time to achieve basic equity for women. I think we have come through a pandemic where we have seen much more closely how women in many of these essential lower wage industries support our economy, support our society, how they are invaluable to our survival. And yet we're really still struggling to achieve basic rights, basic economic security for many of these women. And that just is kind of scratching the surface. I think there are so many dimensions to this issue. Obviously, post Dobbs, we are in an era where women's rights have been further eroded. And so we have a lot of battles on our hand, but we're still fighting. And I think every erosion is also an opportunity to come together and to build back stronger protections, because we know that the ones that we have right now are not sufficient.
We had our challenges before COVID, and now since COVID, what has the fight been like, and what's it been like? What have you noticed in terms of gender inequality and how we've been dealing in this matter since COVID?
You know, unfortunately, I think there was some momentum during the COVID pandemic. I think many of the issues that we have long been trying to bring to the forefront were much more obvious, right? The deep inequities that exist for so many women in our society, the fact that we rely on them, we don't pay women enough. They became very obvious, the things that we're constantly trying to put out there. But unfortunately, we're still really fighting. And I think, you know, just to give you a little bit of background, based on the work that we've been doing, based on the research we've done, based on the research of many of our partner organizations, we know that across the country, women still earn less, are paid less, have less wealth, and are more economically insecure. And the implications for women of color are drastically worse. Women of color are facing intersecting forms of discrimination based on gender and race. And that means that they face the highest rates of economic insecurity in our country. Nationally, I think looking at the gender pay gap is a really good way of understanding the issue. Nationally, if you take into account full-time and part-time work, women make approximately 78 cents per every dollar that a man makes. And then if you dig down to look at women of color, the figures are appalling, right? Black women make approximately 66 cents for every dollar a white non-Hispanic man makes. Latina women make 52 cents. 52 cents for every dollar a white non-Hispanic man makes in this country. And that's kind of just the beginning of it, right? We know that women of color are more likely to work low wage, minimum wage jobs. We know that they're more likely to have difficulty accessing decent, affordable, high quality childcare. They're oftentimes relying on family members. They are more likely to work precarious exploitative working conditions. And as a result of many of these factors, they're more likely to either live in poverty or be at risk of living in poverty. These were the realities we were facing before the pandemic. These are the realities that we continue to face post-pandemic. And I think one thing we need to be explicitly clear about is that these disparities are the direct result of kind of long-term systemic discrimination that exists in our economy, as well as discrimination that exists on the surface.
Right.
And we really need bold and urgent action to address these inequities. And I think there is, thankfully, due to the pandemic, more momentum, more collaboration around doing those things, but it's not urgent enough.
Yeah, Seher, as the director of economic justice at Legal Momentum, using that word momentum, talk to me about some of the projects you have. What are the things that you're really doing in terms of at Legal Momentum to really help in this fight that is certainly uphill and very much necessary?
Well, Daren, as you mentioned, Legal Momentum is a national civil rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality. I think traditionally our focus has been and continues to be on advancing the rights of women, but as our conceptions of gender have evolved, our work has evolved to take into account the rights of transgender individuals, non-binary individuals. We do work in different ways. We engage in impact litigation, so trying to bring cases where we are really trying to have an impact on challenging gender discrimination in our society. We engage in policy and legislative work, so trying to enact cutting edge legislation to really address some of those underlying structures that we feel are discriminatory and problematic. And then we engage in educational Know Your Rights initiatives. So we're training people across the spectrum, from judges to advocates to women workers to students. And we have a national helpline. And some of the issues that we focus on and have focused on throughout our 50 years are violence against women. We were critical in helping to draft and enact the Federal Violence Against Women Act and to get it reauthorized over the years. We work on equity in education, fairness in the courts. Reproductive rights is a space where we have kind of upped our game in the past years. We've worked there historically, but now we're doing more work in that space to kind of address the urgent need. And of course, we do a lot of work on workplace equality and economic justice. As you mentioned, one of our core focuses is really centering the needs and the voices of women who we feel are most underserved in our economy. And I think when we think about what's happening to women in those areas, there are a number of drivers of inequity that we're particularly concerned about. So unpaid caregiving, for example, is a big problem. We know that women have disproportionately been tasked with unpaid caregiving responsibilities that result in a number of financial costs and penalties over the course of their career. And that's something we need to address. We know that as a result of those caregiving responsibilities, employers come to the table with a lot of conscious and unconscious biases about women's work, and that factors in very centrally in how employers choose to pay women and how they decide to, when they decide to hire them. Another big problem that we really are trying to address is the problem of occupational segregation. We have seen in our work that women have been disproportionately pushed into low wage work. And low wage work that is low wage precisely because it's considered women's work. And so, again, that's another one of those deep structural problems that we need to break apart. And then lastly, pay secrecy is a big issue we're concerned about. I think, as we know, for too long, employers have been able to perpetuate pay inequity, because it's impossible to unearth both kind of like discrete disparities, but also that those kind of global inequities that exist within our economy. And so, in that respect, pay transparency is a big issue that we are really focusing on and have worked on over the course of the past several years. And I'm happy to talk about that more.
I do want to go back to occupational segregation because I think that so many times people are in the dark when it comes to occupational segregation. That it really doesn't exist until it's like it hits you in the face. So let's go back there for a moment, unpack this a little bit more, because when we talk about how prevalent this is, how are you seeing it from across, from your office when it comes to occupational segregation?
Yeah, I think in the gender justice space for so long, when we think about pay inequity, we've really talked about it from the perspective of the need for equal pay for equal work, right? And that's why we've seen, legislation along the lines of the Federal Equal Pay Act, which mandates equal pay for equal work. And then we've also seen a number of state laws that, mirror or build upon the federal law. Those protections are absolutely essential. But when we start, in a lot of the work that we're doing, we are directly working with women in some of these lower wage occupations that are female dominated, from domestic work to home care to hospitality to the garment industry. And when you start to think about what women are, the type of work, oftentimes the problems they're facing are not occupational segregation. Um, the problems that we are facing have to do with the fact that so many women are segregated in these lower wage occupations where they're working incredibly demanding jobs, and yet they're not being paid fairly. Right. And
Got
so that has really reshaped some of the policy advocacy we're doing so that we're moving beyond this conception of equal pay for equal work. And we're really starting to think about working towards a living wage, for example, right? What we need to see is that we want to see that minimum wage state by state reflects cost of living and increases annually with inflation. So many of the women that we work with, they are working incredibly difficult jobs and they're having a hard time just making ends meet. And I think one piece of that is their work is incredibly devalued. But I think from an kind of immediate perspective, we want to make sure that these women are getting a basic wage that allows them to live in dignity, right? And that has to do with us increasing and indexing minimum wages state by state and at the federal level. Our federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, is the wage from the dark ages. And so it's essential that we start to move that ball forward. I think, yeah.
No,
Sorry, Daren,
no,
were
no,
you?
no, no. I was getting ready to parlay that by saying, listen, as you're talking about that, the first thing I think about is, in order to get there, there has to be this transparency too, right? Because that's pretty huge. We're not seeing the transparency when it comes to wages and pay. They can really bridge the gap sometimes. So I was just going to say, these two things almost kind of go hand in
Absolutely. Don't get me started on or I will get started on talking about
No,
pay transparency.
please get started. Right. There
I
you go.
love talking about pay transparency. So, I think one of the key initiatives that we've worked on in New York City and New York State, along with a number of core organizations, including the Power New York network, is to advance pay transparency protections. And so we worked very closely with Council Member Helen Rosenthal in New York City and Senator Jessica Ramos and Assembly Member Latoya Joyner in New York State to enact pay transparency laws at the local and state levels. Um, those laws we feel are essential towards doing exactly what you said, which is on the one hand, we want to raise wages, but then before we do that, we also need to know a lot about what's happening, how employers are paying people. And so the law in New York State requires employers with 4 or more employees to disclose the a pay range in an advertisement for a job, promotion, or transfer opportunity, and to include a job description if one exists. And we think these laws are absolutely critical to both closing the gender pay gap, but also addressing occupational segregation. And there are no number of reasons that they're so important. In terms of occupational segregation, I think for the first time, these laws are giving us a very basic understanding of what employers are paying for different types of jobs. And I think this is something that's incredibly important for workers across the spectrum. It's incredibly important for women and people of color who are already coming to the table with these artificially depressed salaries based on discrimination. And it's incredibly important for employers so that we're all working towards getting to a place where pay is more fair and equitable.
Yeah. We hear about structural discrimination. I mean, we know that particularly when it comes to women of color, what those statistics actually hold. And it's pretty startling, it's pretty embarrassing, and it's sad that we're having this conversation again in 2023. Uh, how do we get to the place where we can really hold people accountable in this particular area? Because accountability seems to be the biggest challenge, right? That we know what the problem is, we know what the issue is, but now it's really about holding people accountable so that way we can kind of, right this wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, I think under our prevailing culture of pay secrecy, there are a number of barriers that have prevented us from really addressing pay inequity effectively. I think one of the key things that we're concerned about is that it was, before we had any degree of pay transparency, it was practically impossible to unearth problematic pay disparities, right? We couldn't see where they existed because we had no idea what employers were paying people. Um, that was one piece of it. I think another piece of it is that there was no employer accountability because everything that they were doing was behind closed doors. Another big piece of it is that employers have been able to rely on both conscious and unconscious biases in setting salary, and that perpetuated again because we had no idea what any of these jobs were priced at. And then I think, you know, lastly, we've seen that the workers have had absolutely no leverage in the process. And so all of these things factor into creating this very problematic environment. I think one of the most important pieces and strengths of pay transparency legislation that requires employers to disclose the pay upfront in a job posting is that for the first time, we're requiring employers to to be more accountable, right? We can now see what they are potentially paying for different jobs. They have to include that information in the job posting. And so by forcing them to include that information, the idea is that it really encourages them and it pushes them to set pay based on more equitable, fair, objective factors as opposed to pricing the person and not the job. That's been one of our main objectives in pushing for pay transparency legislation is that employers price the job and not the person, and so that they're looking at factors like their budget, um, the relevant qualifications for a particular position, what they've paid their existing employees to carry out that role, instead of making ad hoc decisions that are based on each candidate that comes in the door, which we know results in the biases because employers are judging women and people of color differently. And they're often relying on workers' prior salaries to set their future salary. And that's another problem that we know perpetuates the wage gap.
Oh, yeah, Seher Khawaja, we can talk about this all day, and literally a lot to talk about, unfortunately. But we are out of time, and I do want to get you back. So make sure that you get your calendar ready because we'll have to get you back. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love to be back.
All righty, taking a quick break. We'll be back with more right after this.